What's up, YouTube? It's Nerdy, and welcome back to the Transmissions Draft League. As you can see, I have the Season 4 document in front of me, and today I wanted to do a sort of guide video, kind of similar to the team building videos that I have made as of late. I kind of wanted to walk you through my process for building a draft plan, kind of giving you guys an idea of what to look for, how to build your plans, and if anyone is looking for ideas, feel free to steal some ideas from this draft plan. Obviously, this is not going to be exactly what I am planning on doing this season, so don't feel like you're going to snipe me if you are playing in Season 4. But yeah, we're going to just kind of do this step by step. So I like to have 3 things ready when I am doing something like this. First of all, of course, you have to have the document here. We have all of the tiers here. As you can see, all the way from 20 to 2 points. We have 105 points this season to draft 10 Pokemon. It's pretty normal for us. And then, of course, I also like to have Showdown up. This is a box, so there is a feature on here where you can, instead of building a new team, you can build a box, and this allows you to add more than 6 Pokemon to it. And then finally, of course, like I said, I like to also have a calculator up. This helps me kind of keep track of how many points I'm working with. And I'm going to take you from start to finish on how I build a draft plan, but this is by no means the only way to go about it. This is just like kind of my process. So first of all, I would like to get started with how the heck do you even start building a draft plan? And for me, that is basically picking a Pokemon that I want to build around. As you kind of notice, like as I've been playing in the seasons, generally what happens is I will choose a Pokemon that interests me or that I'm excited to use for a season, and I build a team trying to specifically accentuate that Pokemon. Last season, that Pokemon was, of course, Tyranitar. But the season before that was Raging Bolt, and you can keep going back and be able to tell. This time around, I'm not going to tell you what specifically is piquing my interest, so instead I have a little dice here. This is a D12. Very thankfully, we have exactly 12 Pokemon in the 20-point category, so I'm going to randomly pick a Pokemon in the 20-point category, and we're going to build a team around it. So let's go ahead and start with that. As you can see, I rolled a 1, so we're doing great. And of course, the Pokemon in the 1 slot is Chi-Yu. So let's go ahead and start with that. Chi-Yu is worth 20 points. We're going to take 20 points off of our little thing here, and we'll add Chi-Yu. So Chi-Yu is, of course, a really powerful special attacking fire and dark type. This Pokemon doesn't get a ton of coverage, aside from like Psychic, and then of course Terra Blast. Chi-Yu is an excellent user of Terra, but it is a little bit more offensive, as of course Fire and Dark is actually pretty good typing. Oftentimes it will Terra into Fire to deal extra Fire type damage, or it might Terra into Ground or Water to gain a little bit of coverage for things that might wall it, such as opposing Fire types. That being said, Chi-Yu does a lot of things really great, and one of those things is, of course, Beads of Ruin. This makes its already really good special attack even better, but it also tends to support a teammate. And also, one thing that I also like to do while I'm doing this is I add a nickname to all of the Pokemon that I'm drafting of how many points they're worth. This just kind of gives you an idea of how many points that Pokemon's worth, and how to like continue thinking about them in your draft board. So of course, Chi-Yu being a 20-point Pokemon is probably a Pokemon to build around, center your strategy on, rather than like a supporting piece that you're not going to use every week. That being said, because we are building around Chi-Yu, we want to either accentuate its best qualities and make good use of them, or we want to make up for some of its flaws. So when I think of Chi-Yu, there are probably about 3 items that I think this Pokemon uses super effectively, and more depending on matchups, of course. but I often think of Chi-Yu as either using the Choice Scarf, the Focus Sash, or some kind of Resistance Berry. Now, depending on the team, we can like get away with damage boosting items like the Life Orb, or in fact, the Choice Specs. But generally speaking, the Sash and Scarf are Chi-Yu's main go-tos. So that's what makes Chi-Yu available on basically every team though. So what we can do is we can add Pokemon to this team to try and not make Chi-Yu reliant on those items. So in that case, one of the things that would allow Chi-Yu to not be reliant specifically on Scarf is of course good speed control. So let's take a look at what kind of good speed control there is. Now in my opinion, of course the best speed control is going to be Tornadus. However, we already spent quite a few points on Chi-Yu, and depending on where we are in the draft board, it may not even be available at this point. Another Pokemon that probably won't be available at this point is Whimsicott. The Pokemon is almost, if not just as good as Tornadus, with a lot less damage presence, but it is one of the best support Pokemon out there, and there's a reason why it's 18 points. So that being said, I do think that I still want Prankster Tailwind on this team, and for that reason, we're probably going to be looking at this 15-point category. This holds several Prankster Tailwind Pokemon. We're talking about Pokemon like Volbeat, Illumise, and Murkrow as well. And we can even look at 14 points where we have Talonflame. Now, I'm probably going to be leaning away from Talonflame since it's also a fire type. But that being said, no matter what, all of these Pokemon are going to be weak to Rock as well. So we're probably going to have to make up for that later in the draft. That being said, because there is kind of a large volume of Pokemon that fulfill this role, we can kind of pick and choose. Now, there are going to be some that are better at this role than others, but generally speaking, we just need something that has the combination of Prankster and Tailwind. So for that reason, let's go ahead and take a look at the available choices. So like I said, Illumise, Volbeat, and Murkrow are all available here. Now there are some differences between all of these. In general, Murkrow has the best offensive presence of all of these. In a matchup where Dark or Flying is a powerful type to be using, Brave Bird and Foul Play are actually pretty solid. As for Illumise and Volbeat, basically no offensive presence. But their disruption moves are a little bit different. So I believe Illumise gets Taunt and Fake Tears, I believe. And then Volbeat gets Tail Glow and Baton Pass. For this specifically, I'm okay with any of them. The difference is not really that meaningful to me. I'm going to go ahead and just pick Illumise for the time being. Just because, like I said, it doesn't really matter between these three which one we get. Illumise, like I said, does get some of the things that we're looking for. But the reason why I'm not specifically sold on Volbeat is because Chi-Yu generally doesn't have the bulk to be able to be doing that kind of setup over and over, and it generally can't switch in to take hits because it has a low HP stat. And for that reason, we have to take advantage of Chi-Yu forcing switches to get setups rather than having it in the back to receive a Baton Pass boost. But like I said, we do still have really good supporting moveset here on Illumise. So Illumise, like I said, is worth 15 points. And so let's go ahead and subtract 15 points from our little board here. So now we have 2 Pokemon drafted. We have 8 to go and only 70 points to spend on them. Now let's continue looking down the board. So like we said, Chi-Yu has a lot of really good traits. And now with this next pick, I really want to be able to accentuate one of those, which is of course Beads of Ruin. Being able to stack special attackers is one way to make Chi-Yu even better at its job just by being able to be on the field. Now, like I mentioned, Chi-Yu doesn't switch into hits all that great, but just by switching into the field, it can make an already powerful special attacker even stronger. So we can kind of look for special attackers that are fast. They don't necessarily have to be that fast, but fast special attackers that will also benefit from being able to have their damage boosted. Now there's a lot of these available. Honestly, go basically anywhere in this specific one. I really like the fact that we have the ability to use something like Sun, for example, with Illumise, as it does get Prankster and Sunny Day. So for that reason, let's go ahead and look at a Photosynthesis Mon. So this is another Pokemon that's going to be able to benefit from the sun. And let's take a look at special attack. So we have a ton of options here. I think we are talking about the third round, so we could be missing all three of these top three Pokemon. But it's also like kind of interchangeable with which ones we can use. I think this team would benefit from having any one of these three on it. Walking Wake is of course really great because it offers us an alternative damage type that is really hard to protect against, especially because one of the best ways to stop Chi-Yu is actually using the rain. It halves Chi-Yu's fire damage output, and although the Walking Wake won't get a photosynthesis boost, its signature move Hydro Steam will still get a boost in the rain because it is a water type attack, and for that reason kind of stops opposing weather strategies. So I am going to actually add Walking Wake. Like I said, it's not super likely to actually be here at this point, but you can interchange this for another Paradox Pokemon such as Sandy Shocks if you would like, or there is one other Paradox Pokemon that I'm going to mention here as another backup option. So like we said, Walking Wake is 19 points, so we are spending quite a bit yet again. So let's go ahead and remove 19 points from our total here. A quick shout out here is to Iron Bundle. This Pokemon's insanely fast and can function without Tailwind, giving us a sort of like Chi-Yu plus bundle mode, where just by having Chi-Yu on the field, Iron Bundle can deal extra damage and is so much faster than the entire rest of the draft board that it threatens a lot of damage really early on without our opponent really being able to react. The other really nice thing about Pokemon as speedy as Bundle and Draft is that oftentimes you'll go up against teams where you don't really need to invest in your speed, allowing you to invest those points elsewhere when you wouldn't be able to do that in standard games. And this kind of turns Bundle from a really fast, frail special attacker into a much more well-rounded Pokemon that can actually take hits and deal out really reasonable damage. A lot of you who remember Season 2 will remember that's how Iron Bundle played on that Season 2 team. So if you're thinking that Walking Wake is too rich for your blood, potentially you can drop down to 17 points to grab Iron Bundle. Alright, so like I said, Walking Wake is 19 points. We're kind of running out of points at this point. We spent already quite a few on our first three with only 51 points left for our last 7 Pokemon. Now is probably time to start looking down the draft board for value picks that will still give us a lot of great support, but maybe aren't necessarily too expensive. So looking down the board here, I really like the ability to throw on Fake Out here. Any different number of Fake Out users will work here. The reason why Fake Out is really good, by the way, is because we have several very powerful special attackers, and being able to position them using our Fake Out Pokemon really allows us to get away with different moves that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. Fake Out is another type of pressure technique. So this team currently has pressure in terms of damage with both Chi-Yu and Walking Wake, or Iron Bundle, depending on how you're going to take this draft plan. Fake Out allows you to have a different type where your opponent can't really respond to your damage. And in this way, they're forced to play defensively, either through protect or switching. This gives an offensive team a ton of space to really start snowballing really quickly, whether that's through nasty plot or setting up the sun, like I said, different types of ways to just really stack up multipliers that will make it overwhelming for your opponent to play defensively. So, one of the best Pokemon for that, as we've seen in a lot of seasons to this point, is probably Raichu. Raichu fits a little bit better on other teams that are using stuff like Rain, mostly because it has that Lightning Rod. It protects a lot of your Pokemon that are electric weak. And this team is not electric weak. In fact, we have 0 electric weaknesses. But Raichu is such a fast Pokemon, again, like we were talking about Iron Bundle. It's such a fast Pokemon that oftentimes we can just not invest in our speed, allowing us to invest in our other stats and make it a much more well-rounded Pokemon. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and add Raichu to this team. Now Raichu is only 5 points, so we're getting a really good Pokemon for a discount. And again, like we said, it's such a fast Pokemon on a team that already has speed control that it might actually become a little bit more valuable offensively thanks to that. So we're going to go ahead and add Raichu here. Like we said, Raichu is only 5 points, so we drop down to only 46 points for our next 6 Pokemon. A very reasonable amount of points to start working with. Alright, so let's continue looking on. I do kind of want to have a secondary mode for this. Teams that are faster and have the ability to slow down our damage may become an issue for this team, as oftentimes we're trying to just hit a nail so hard that it goes through anyways. But if we're not able to hit the nail on the head hard enough, we need to have like counterpunch that doesn't allow our opponents to get too comfortable. Now, like I said, we have a couple of options here. We have a Sun mode, which does allow us to draft yet another Paradox Pokemon here. And I'm genuinely considering it. Chi-Yu tends to work really well on teams like this that have a lot of Pokemon that benefit from similar types of things that Chi-Yu does. Basically, it just means that one sunny day turns the entire team from a team of like powerful, strong Pokemon to an overwhelming threat that can't really be stopped. One Pokemon that I'm looking at in particular is one that hasn't actually been used, I don't believe. Slitherwing is an excellent Pokemon for only 9 points. Now it is a bit of a Terra Hog, but this Pokemon hits incredibly hard. And like we kind of said in draft, you don't have to invest in specific things when the matchup doesn't call for it. Only one team's going to have a Flutter Mane, and for that reason Slitherwing can kind of get away with not having to worry about that matchup. And it allows that Pokemon to deal damage in a way that a lot of other Pokemon can't. It gets First Impression, which is an excellent thing for a slow bug-type physical attacker. But on top of that, it gets really excellent coverage in both Close Combat and Flare Blitz, which are really high base power moves on a really powerful physical attacker that kind of outweighs the struggles of our slowness. So for that reason, I'm going to add Slitherwing. Slitherwing, like we said, kind of a slow, very powerful physical attacker that actually has very reasonable bulk. 85, 79, and 105, super workable. And although the typing is a little bit rough, because we do have Terra available and not really a super Terra hungry team, Slitherwing can... Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. A little bit of a break in the recording. Anyways, like I was saying, Slitherwing, very underrated Pokemon that I think should be added to this team as this sort of counterpunch. So let's go ahead and subtract 9 points from there. Remember, we are at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Pokemon. We are halfway through this team already, and we only have 37 points left. So let's make sure that we are a little bit more frugal with our points going forward. Alright. So continuing to look around here, there are a couple of other things that I would actually like to add here as, like I said, a counterpunch to this team. Now, like I said, one of the main strategies of this team is actually going to be Tailwind. Now, there are a few Pokemon that really benefit from Tailwind, and honestly, one of those Pokemon is, again, another Pokemon that I think has been underutilized or undervalued, really, and that's going to be Bramblegast. Bramblegast is another 9-point Pokemon, but it's another physical attacker that really benefits from our strategy. Windrider being able to give it that attack boost on an already pretty solid attack. Grass and Ghost is also a pretty nice offensive combo, and it's a bit faster than Slitherwing, kind of giving us a little bit more options with how we deal with our opponent. And on top of that, Poltergeist and Power Whip are very high base power moves that really give our opponent something to think about, as well as we have a very consistent priority attack to really start picking things off, especially when we have things stacked up like the Life Orb and the Windrider boost. So I think I am willing to spend the points on this Pokemon. Now there is an argument that this is maybe a little bit samey with Slitherwing, so if you are concerned about having too many of the same things on this team, you can definitely consider changing that up a little bit. But for now, let's go ahead and subtract 9 more points, seeing that we have 28 points for 4 Pokemon. So we have to average about 7 points for our next few. Now that doesn't mean that we don't get to spend on our next Pokemon. But I think we should continue looking around here. Now, we're kind of in an awkward spot, where this team has a lot of everything that I look for already, and there's not really a reason to keep looking around for too much more. The only few things that I would want to continue adding to teams are things like Intimidate, Redirection, a lot of different ways that really give your team a lot of space to play. They aren't super necessary if I'm being completely honest, but they are really nice things to have. So let's continue looking around here. Like I said, we're kind of just sticking at the lower categories here. The other things that we can look for also, by the way, is just ways to maybe stop opposing strategies. Just ways to deter our opponents from playing strategies that we might have a hard time dealing with. One thing that this team might struggle against is perhaps Trick Room, so we can maybe try to look for something that's on the cheaper side and allows us to kind of shut that down. There's a couple of options here, kind of looking around. Let's go ahead and actually look on Showdown. So for me, the best way to stop Trick Room is actually Imprison, Move, and Trick Room. Any Pokemon that learns both of these moves basically does the job that we're looking for. We want a relatively bulky Pokemon here. So let's kind of look around. We also kind of want something that can work with the strategy that we already have. For example, I'm actually kind of looking at Exeggutor here. Now, traditionally, not a great Pokemon actually, but it does have actually relatively decent stats. Chlorophyll is obviously really nice to work with our Sun strategy, but Harvest also works with the Sun, assuming that we have a pretty good matchup, or if we're willing to spend our Terra on Exeggutor. It can kind of be a late game win con. This also, by the way, doubles as a way to kind of disincentivize your opponent from using something like Psychic Terrain, as Exeggutor is another Pokemon that can actually make use of opposing Psychic Terrains. So yeah, I think I'm willing to add Exeggutor to this team. So let's go ahead and check here where Exeggutor is. Exeggutor is actually at a discount here. It's only worth 6 points here. And like we said, for the team that we're building here, for this specific role that we are trying to fill, Exeggutor actually kind of fits that super well. So let's go ahead and actually add it to the team for only 6 points. Alright, we're starting to fill up this team pretty quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Pokemon already. We only have 4 left to go. Wait, is that correct? 1, 2, 3, 6, 7. So only 3 left to go, sorry. With 22 points still, we are actually looking really good. We have not spent too many points on this team. Now I think it's actually worth considering if we want to spend a little bit more. We have 22 points with 3 Pokemon left, which means that we actually can spend as high as 18 points on this Pokemon if we're willing to grab 2 really low tier Pokemon. And I think I am willing to grab at least 1 really low tier Pokemon. So perhaps we can, instead of spending 18, balance it out a little bit more. So let's kind of look. One Pokemon that in Regulation F, standard play, in tournaments and stuff, that has been a great partner has actually been Glimmora. Glimmora is a really great Pokemon that tends to really beat a lot of the things that beat Chi-Yu, but it also benefits from Chi-Yu's Beads of Ruin. And mostly just because it beats Incineroar. But Glimmora also learns Meteor Beam, meaning that it can boost its own special attack, dealing a ton of damage in the process, and therefore doesn't really need Chi-Yu. So that is a potential add there as well. We can also potentially look at just another kind of support Pokemon to work in the same vein as something like Raichu or even Illumise. Just another Pokemon that generally does good stuff for us, but isn't necessarily completely needed. And I know I'm kind of hemming and hawing about this, but this is kind of like the point in the draft where you're kind of looking around at other teams and making a decision about what your team needs going forward. So thinking about the team that we have so far, we have a great first strategy in Chi-Yu and Walking Lake. Those two are going to be very difficult to stop on every given week, but we also have a pretty powerful counterpunch with Slitherwing and Bramblegast. So from here, we can kind of like just choose whatever we would like, to be honest. Now, if you can't tell, I'm also not really too worried about our type matchups. And that's because in VGC, it kind of doesn't matter. I know in singles, it's a lot more important to make sure that you have a counter for basically every type, almost necessitating that you draft a very wide range of different Pokemon types. In VGC, that's not necessary. A lot of the times, VGC is such a fast-paced game that you can kind of just beat your opponent into submission if your strategy is strong enough, and therefore you don't really need that type diversity. So kind of looking around here, I'd be willing to spend on another Pokemon. Again, not super necessary. I think what I'm gonna grab here is actually a redirection Pokemon. This allows us to just be able to fire off our consistent damage, and because we do have spread damage in the form of Chi-Yu, that's even more valuable if I'm being honest. So there's a couple of choices here. I'm looking at 11 points so that we can save a few points here as well. So the 3 Pokemon in this category, it's going to be very similar to the support Pokemon we were looking at for Tailwind. Again, it's not going to super matter. There might be one that we prefer more than the other 2, but in this case, it doesn't truly matter. In 11 points, there's going to be Clefable, Electabuzz, and Magmar. We can also even look at 10 points if we wanted to grab something like Electivire instead. I think any of these are going to be fine. Basically, we're just looking for a redirection here. The ones that I do want to avoid actually is going to be Magmar and Magmortar, just because they have similar typings to a Pokemon we're already going to be redirecting from. So any move that's aimed at Chi-Yu is probably going to do pretty well into those 2 as well. So we're probably going to want something else. And so it's for that reason that I'm actually thinking about Clefable. Because a ground type move that's aimed at Chi-Yu is also going to hurt Electabuzz and Electivire. So we're probably going to grab Clefable here. Now traditionally, Clefable is actually not very good in VGC. Clefairy is actually way better because it gets front guard and it can use the Eviolite, so it is slightly bulkier than Clefable. However, Clefable is still fine, and it's on here as kind of a discount Clefairy that doesn't get Friend Guard. It might be able to be a little bit more offensively present, but for the most part, we're kind of just using it as a follow me bot. So let's go ahead and subtract 11 points from this draft, and I'm going to show you how to get the best value out of your last couple of picks when you are starting to run out of points. So we have 11 points left, which is actually quite a few. At this point in the draft, 11 points is kind of enough to start controlling the draft. But there is one really low tier Pokemon that I want to take a look at here. That's actually going to be Vulpix. So Vulpix is, of course, the pre-evolution to Ninetales, but that does mean that it also gets Drought. So this kind of means that in specific matchups where it is beneficial for us to instantly change the weather without needing to use a Moose Blot, and Vulpix is actually great for that. Now we have what this does is it gives us a cheap option to do both. We can either use our Prankster Weather Setter, or we can use a Drought Setter. And like I said, Vulpix is only 3 points. And that's great value for a Pokemon at this point in the draft. Basically, when you start getting to 4 points and below, you're looking specifically for roles and fillers. They're not going to come every week. They're not going to be a part of your main game plan, although maybe Vulpix will, depending on what matchups look like. But you are trying to use them for very specific purposes. And Vulpix's purpose is to instantaneously set up the sun for our powerful special attackers and our photosynthesis Pokemon. Now, thankfully, Vulpix isn't completely useless. Once it is on the field, it does learn a Helping Hand and Encore, and as well as Disable, which is really nice, but it can also remove itself from the field by using Memento or Healing Wish, allowing us to get another very powerful Pokemon in. But this Pokemon, like I said, is mostly just here as a support Pokemon, so we're not expecting it to do a ton of damage. So yeah, just kind of going to be nice to have. That being said, we now only have 1 pick left, and we have 8 points to spend on that final Pokemon. So let's take a look. Basically now we're just grabbing the best Pokemon in the 8-point category. Whatever kind of floats our boat here is what we're going to be looking at here. There are a lot of great Pokemon in the 8-point category, so let's just take a look here, honestly. We don't have a Fairy type, so we could potentially consider something like a Florges or a Ribombee. Like I said, we do have a sort of anti-Trick Room mode, but we can potentially draft our own Trick Room mode with something like Slowking, which is another like nasty plot Pokemon that might be able to take over a game. Or we could even potentially grab another like Chi-Yu Counterpunch ally here. I'm specifically looking at Zoroark Hisui. Now, Zoroark Hisui is honestly kind of just a gimmick Pokemon. It's not that great, and that's why it's only 8 points in this draft. But it is a decent partner for Chi-Yu, but it is also decent for it to be disguised as a Chi-Yu, as you're not really going to be firing dark moves at it, but you might be firing fighting type moves at Chi-Yu, which is something that Zoroark Hisui is actually immune to. So this kind of allows Zoroark Hisui to kind of like be a deceptive, potentially strong Pokemon. It's probably going to be a Pokemon that isn't going to hit hard enough, but maybe with a Beads of Ruin boost, it can do a little bit better. But as we also said, we have drafted a fair amount of support Pokemon that are designed to give our Pokemon space. That might allow Zoroark Hisui to run something like Nasty Plot and sweep a team from there. But we can also just use Zoroark Hisui as like a sort of like deceptive little counterpunch to our Chi Walking Wake mode, which kind of allows us to disguise it as any Pokemon and just kind of throw curveballs at our opponent constantly. So I think that's a decent enough addition here. The other thing to also mention, it's 110 speed, just like Raichu. So it is yet another really fast Pokemon that, in the right matchup, will be able to run 0 speed IVs, continue to outspeed our entire opponent's team, which allows us to potentially even run mixed Zoroark Hisui to make use of that great coverage that this Pokemon gets, or even the really good support moveset that it gets. But yeah, that is kind of how I build a draft plan here. Um, Hopefully this was informative. Um, like I said, all of this was kind of off the rip. How I really design these draft plans. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Hopefully this helps you with your future draft plans. Like I said, feel free to take ideas from this. If I see this exact team um, during the draft, you'll get a shout out. No extra brownie points, but probably going to be a pretty strong team. In my opinion, if you do get this exact team, this is honestly going to be a really tough out for basically every team. I think a lot of these Pokemon are super underrated. But yeah, that's all I have for you in this video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and let me know if you enjoyed this. But yeah, like I said, that's all I have. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.